Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening. I'm Kelly Rudin. I am the chapter regent for the Daughters of the American Revolution Drumhill chapter, and it's my honor to join you this evening representing the DAR on this Veterans Day, particularly with our community partners, the Westport Library, the Westport Museum for History and Culture, and VFW Post 399. To our veterans in attendance, we appreciate and honor you. Tonight, I'm wearing an additional hat as a member of Westport's America 250 Committee, and I'm joined by fellow member, the incredible artist, Miggs Burrows. And over the last few months, a small committee has met to set up the framework for the town's commemorative events and celebrations of the 250th anniversary of our Constitution. And tonight, we'll see if I'm good at this, let's see. It is our pleasure to unveil the official town logo designed by Miggs Burrows. Woo! So we're really excited about this. We also have an additional surprise, the official Westport America 250 website. So this site will capture events around town for community organizations. So, whoop, there it goes. See, there's tonight's event is the first official event. It will have a feature on historic landmarks, some locations around town, some organizations, and then there is a special Westport Then and Now section, which these are based on Miggs's lenticular art, which they're fabulous. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see them. There also is a forum that invites community members to volunteer, make suggestions, and learn more. And launching very soon, there'll be a special America 250 merchandise store on the website. The proceeds will help to fund the celebrations and the events in the community. So there is a time capsule that was buried 50 years ago that will be unveiled, and we also hope to bury a new time capsule in 2026. So I hope that you'll visit the site and stay up to date on America 250 in Westport. And if tonight's program has you wondering if you may have a revolutionary patriot in your family, you can see me after the program. It is now my pleasure to turn this over to Michelle Rubin from the Westport Museum for History and Culture, who will introduce our program. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Michelle Rubin. I am the Director of Education and Development at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. We too will be doing a year-long exhibit in 2026 called America 250, Real Revolution. So that will be popping up on our website and with Westport 250, so keep an eye out for that. It's my great, great pleasure to introduce Professor Edward Larson, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for his incredible book on the Scopes monkey trial called Summer for the Gods. And his new book tonight is, I've got to look at my thing here, it's called, get the words right, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. Dr. Larson, do you say doctor or professor? Do you prefer? Okay. Professor Larson has an article appearing right now in the Atlantic Monthly. It'll give you a really wonderful taste of this book, and you will want to read every word of the book once you read that article. So without any more ado, I want to introduce Edward Larson and his new book. I'm sorry, I keep declaring independence. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Okay. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. Thank you for coming out. My name is Aaron Weinstein. I'm assistant professor of politics at Fairfield University. I actually have a couple students in the audience. I made the long trek down here from Fairfield, so I'd like to thank them for making their way. So I prepared a couple questions, or more than a couple questions, for Edward. But the first one I want to start with actually just comes down to, you know, when I think of 1776, the temptation is to think of, well, the Declaration of Independence. And of course, that's an entire year's worth of events. 364 other days that matter. And your book does a really wonderful job of painting a vivid history from, you know, New Year's Day through the end of December. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you came to appreciate or sort of find important in those other 364 days that we sort of forget around July 4th.
What struck me, you know, wherever you go, what you read back then, these people back then spoke of the spirit of 1776. They recognized, all of them recognized 1776 was the key year. A year later, the Great Seal of the United States was created by the Secretary of the Congress, and it says liberty. No, it says something new under the sun in Latin, and that's going to be important. Something new under the sun. You can look on your $1 bill and see it on the back, but then below it says 1776. So they're focusing on that year. And so I wanted to see, since they were all focusing on that year, later Jefferson would make a comment saying, you know, the glorious descendants of 1776. I happened to be at the Texas Book Festival, and they had a statue in front of the, walking through, this was last weekend, and just by chance, I was walking through the Capitol grounds, and they have a huge statue of the Confederate war dead. And on this statue, the statue of the ground, it says, these people fought, in honor of these people who fought to preserve the spirit of 1776, which was states' rights, of course. So the point is, they looked at this year. And I said, okay, what's important about that year? Why did then and thereafter they look to this year? Not to the whole Revolutionary War. As we all know, the Revolutionary War, you know, the fighting begins in 1775. It ends in 1780, well, 1 or 3, depending on when the treaty was signed, or Battle of Yorktown. But they're talking in 1776. And so, and I looked at McCullum's book, and it's just military history. I love Rich Atkinson. If you want to read military history, I'd recommend Rich Atkinson. But they talk about military history. But when you think about it, nothing really very important happened in military history in 1776. 1775 was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill. They got things going. In 1775, they adopted the Declaration of Causes for taking up arms. They appointed George Washington. The Congress adopted the militia, your Connecticut militia and the Massachusetts militia that were surrounding Boston after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That was 1775. Washington was appointed to head the army in 1775. The key battles for the outcome of the war were Saratoga, 1777, and Yorktown, which of course affected you up here because they didn't want the French troops to get down there, and that's why you were attacked here this area. But that was 1781, as you know. I'm sure you know better than I. So what happened in 1776 that mattered? And so if you follow this year from beginning to end, when it began, virtually no one supported independence. Not Adams, not Washington. Franklin probably privately had come around because of his experiences in England, but there was no consensus, there was no argument. In fact, if you look at the Declaration for the causes for taking up arms, it specifically says right in it, we are not seeking separation from Britain. We are seeking our birthright as British subjects of the king. And then the Olive Branch Petition and so on. By the end of 1776, most people most American patriots with an opinion on the matter supported independence. They had given up, they were still seeking liberty, but they were seeking liberty as citizens of independent Republican states with written constitutions. They had come around to believe that they could never obtain their liberty under a king. And what they needed to do was to create something new under the sun. And they knew that phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. Something new under the sun, which is what the seal of the United States says. Something new under the sun. It begins with Thomas Paine in his Common Sense saying, this is something entirely new that we are seeking. No greater cause was ever in the history of the world, he says. And that same spirit is echoed by John Adams in his Thoughts on Government pamphlet, which is so critical, because they came around and decided, we need something new. And that something new was the people are sovereign, not a king. Think about, read Shakespeare. When they refer to a king or he's out there fighting in the histories, it's always England. They don't say Henry III, they say England or France for that king. That's because, as the King Louis said, the state is me. And what Americans were, and the King of England was thinking, the state is me. And what Americans decided during that period, no, the state is us. And therefore they wrote the first written constitutions in the history of the world, establishing popular rule. And as Paine says in Common Sense, and as Adams says in Thoughts on Government, his most important pamphlet, in America, the law is king. And that's the transition that occurs, that a whole people, sure, the seeds have been sown by what happened before. Obviously, Thomas Paine's Common Sense fell on fertile soil, but it sprang up so that after reading it, that same month, it came out on January 17th, that same month, Washington writes a letter that says the active warfare, coupled with the irrefutable logic of that pamphlet, Common Sense, soon everyone will be for separation. Everyone will be for independence. And that's why the year is important. And the Declaration of Independence is simply, well, as John Adams said, piecework of an afternoon, pulling together ideas that were already current of Republican government, of overthrowing the monarchy, and of establishing the people. Every state had to write a new constitution, except Connecticut, unfortunately, and Rhode Island, because of the fluke of the I could explain. But all the other states came up with new constitutions, and they all carry this spirit. But the Constitution of North Carolina is typical. The opening line says that all sovereignty lies with the people. That was something new under the sun.
So that's a fantastic, I mean, you said so much there. Actually, I want to hone in on one thing quickly, which is you mentioned Washington's appreciation for the importance of common sense. And the thing that I love about your book is that you do a really wonderful job of showing both the importance of historical event, like the battles, right, being potentiating aspects of the ideas, but also that the ideas are in some ways made possible by the events going on. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between ideas and the philosophy that was the thrust of the revolution, and also the events and the battles that sort of took place across that year?
That's a very good observation, because the year, it was the words gave rise to actions, which were people taking up arms and fighting the British and engaging in battles. And then the actions fed and reinforced the words. It was back and forth, and you couldn't do it without. But what I go through is, you know, a lot of writings of the individual soldiers, of what they were fighting for. And they knew these words. They'd read Common Sense, and they understood it. Washington had it read to the troops, but they read it themselves. He didn't have the crisis, which ends the war. That's in December, the crisis #1 by Tom Paine. It wasn't Washington that ordered. The men read it themselves. And those words, those thoughts, they expressed it in their writings back home to their wives. This is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for liberty. We're fighting for representative government, or however they'd call it, the rule of the people. We're fighting for a phrase you read throughout that pops up. What are they fighting for? They're fighting for security, they're fighting for liberty, and they're fighting for happiness. Because, as Adam says, that the end of government is the happiness of the people. And Thomas Paine had that's some thoughts of government. So Thomas Jefferson doesn't invent the pursuit of happiness. Adams had already written it, Thoughts of Government, most popular pamphlet and most important pamphlet he ever wrote. That came out in March. But in January, Thomas Paine had said virtually the same thing. He said, what we want to create, what we seek to create, and only a representative government to do it, is the government that leads to the greatest happiness of people at the least cost. He was a bit of a libertarian. And so you see that echo through. And so when finally Thomas Jefferson pulls those ideas together in what are the inalienable rights? Life, that's security. Liberty, that's what they've been fighting for ever since the Stamp Act crisis 10 years earlier. And the pursuit of happiness. And in so many ways, the way he pulls it together in phrase, that has continued to echo. That's part of the legacy of 1776. Because if you want to encapsulate what I think people believe, Americans instinctively believe is the American dream, is the right to life, liberty, and happiness, pursuit of happiness. That's the American dream.
No, that's fantastic. And so going back, so again, my own bias is toward the ideas and the philosophy. It's the stuff that I study. And so I found it really interesting to learn the military aspect, the historical aspect. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Washington. So when I learned about Washington as a child, when I learned about Washington, talk about him, in class, we often talk about the great General Washington. But I was struck by how many setbacks, how difficult that year was. Can you talk a little bit about I guess the strategies that he had to pursue and how that, I guess, shaped how he was viewed at the time?
Washington had never commanded a large army. He had gained some notoriety as the colonel, that is the top officer in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War. And it made him a sort of a local hero, and he was known. And they needed an American. And he had been elected, of course, his brother died, so he got Mount Vernon, and he married the richest woman and richest widow in Virginia, and got in the House of Burgesses, and then was elected to the Continental Congress. And so he's in the Continental Congress with a military background, and the only person in the Congress with an equivalent military background was Benjamin Franklin, who had been colonel in charge of the Pennsylvania militia. in the same war, French and Indian War, but he was so old. And so Washington gets to command the troops, but he really doesn't have a lot of experience, nothing with the types of armies, because he took over command of the New England militia surrounding Boston. So they wanted to nationalize the war. So as we all know, a Virginia general was appointed to be in charge, but all the effective leaders were from the generals from Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New Hampshire. But he was over them. He learned to listen to them. He had one trait, he had a great trait, he always listened to others. And took counsel before battle of all of his leaders, and many of the great leaders in Boston were from New England. And 20,000 colonial militia up there. They become the Continental Army. But he's never run anything like this. So thanks to getting the cannons from Ticonderoga, and the reason why he got the cannons from Ticonderoga was the Connecticut militia with the Vermont militia had taken Ticonderoga, and they had the cannons up there, and Colonel Knox then figured out how to pull them over the snow and get them to Boston. And so he freed Boston, evacuated the troops. The 4,000 or so Boston British in Boston were pulled out and went up to Nova Scotia. But then they were coming back to New York. So he has to defend New York, and that's where you all come in, because this army, this 20,000 Patriot Army, marches right through here. A lot of them go on ships. They board up in New London or wherever and go on ships, but some of them march right through here, go down to defend, because they knew they were going to come back to New York City. And they came back in late July and August of 1776. And Washington had no idea how to command an army, especially since the British came back with 32,000 soldiers. 8,000 of those were Hessian mercenaries. These were trained troops, nothing like what was in Boston. The largest foreign army the British had ever assembled, and as well as virtually the entire British Navy. We used to joke that when the whole Navy was in the upper harbor in New York, in the inner harbor, that you could walk from one side to the other just on British ships. So Washington's troops try to defend Manhattan by being placed in what's now Brooklyn, then would be considered the Heights, out in Long Island, but as you know, Brooklyn is part of Long Island, and in the Brooklyn Heights, and the British just smash them, and Washington barely gets them out. And then he makes strategic mistakes in Manhattan, leaves troops in Fort Washington as he escapes up toward White Plains. And then he gets pushed out of White Plains, and then he gets knocked all the way across New Jersey after losing 2,000 men, which he shouldn't have lost at Fort Washington, which was right where the Manhattan end of the George Washington Bridge, I think that's what it's called, the one that goes across from Manhattan, that goes to Washington Heights. And so it's just a slaughter. And tremendous numbers of American troops are captured by the thousands, and they're put in prison hulks, ships without any masts sitting in the East River, where they die. I mean, they're disease, lack of food. It's a true atrocity of the war. And then crossing New Jersey, following Washington, there are atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. And those are some of the actions that stir the Americans. The atrocities committed against the Americans, citizens in New Jersey, troops in New York, help stir, do not weaken the American spirit. They strengthen it to fight back, because it reconvinces them with the core idea. As I like to put it, before 1776, Americans were fighting. They'd been fighting since 1765, but they'd been fighting for no taxation without representation. And they were never targeting the king. They were always looking to the king to be their savior, and the enemy was Parliament. You can look at every petition. It's always directed against Parliament. Parliament, Parliament, because they didn't elect any Parliament. So they thought the problem was that they didn't get any voters to elect it. But the king was over all the people. What they realized after the king's speech in October of 1775, which only reached the colonists appeared in newspapers in January, about the same time Common Sense came out. And I do think that reading the king's speech from the throne, where he says the colonies are in revolt, we're going to put it down, we're going to send down more troops, more ships, and the Hessian missionaries. It's the combination of the two. And now, after that, they're no longer fighting for no taxation without representation. They're fighting for rule of law. They're fighting for popular sovereignty. They're fighting to create Republican government. And remember, this was a time there was no Republican government in the world. They didn't exist. There were no written constitutions had ever been written before. The theory of them in Locke and other places, but and the social contract theories of Rousseau, but they embraced it. And so it's the actions in the war, even the failures, the enormous failures of 1776 in the battlefield, and they were legend, that helped stir this commitment to independence.
So another thing that I learned, and again, I learned so much from the book, a thing I didn't know about was, of course, the importance of state constitutions and the creation of state constitutions. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit either about maybe a specific one that you found particularly interesting, or talk about them in totality? Why did you feel that talking about the state constitutions was so important to your story?
The state constitutions were the new novel experiment. That's what they were fighting about. Indeed, while he was working on it, Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter, he said, this is really what it's all about. If we don't get this right, we might as well just take the government that the British were trying to force on us and not gone through all this. This is, getting this right, it is the most important thing. And so Jefferson worked on the Virginia Constitution, which was very important. The Pennsylvania had a beautiful constitution. And what they were doing was trying to craft out of whole cloth how the people can rule. What checks and balances do you need? What rights? But they typically begin, there's one of two orders. They either typically begin with a Declaration of Rights. We are fighting, you think, what is the end of government? The Thoughts on Government pamphlet by Adams that I wrote about was a pamphlet of how to write a constitution. He wrote this pamphlet that was, I think, the most important thing he ever wrote. And how to write a constitution. And what he says is, how can the people rule? Always before, it was the king was sovereign, and he gave out rights. Now they're saying these rights are unalienable. They're self-evident. They exist. They weren't self-evident to anybody before Adams and Franklin and Jefferson. It was Franklin's words, the self-evident truth, was Franklin's phrasing. He was on the committee with Jefferson and Adams. And I should say, Roger Sherman, since he's from this state, that these were inalienable, self-evident, and we are fighting for these liberties. The end of government, Adams wrote, is individual liberty, protecting individual liberty. Could you imagine a king, King George, ever saying that, or even thinking it, or Henry VIII, or Louis XIV? It's just inconceivable. They wouldn't have even thought that way. Or in Denmark, then Christian IV, they were into just the opposite, absolute monarchy at that time. And so they would begin either with a Declaration of Rights, Or they would begin with the grievances against the king, what the king had done to him. It's no parliament anymore, it's the king. The king has done this, the king has burned Falmouth, the king has destroyed Norfolk. That happened on the first day of January. That's the opening line of 1776. It's the British bombardment of Norfolk, which at that time was the second largest city in America, in the American South, and the destruction of that. Falmouth, Massachusetts before that, up in Maine, what's now Portsmouth. These sort of atrocities. So it begins either with the tyrannical acts of the king or the liberties. It depends on which they put first, but they all start with that. They start with the liberties and they start with the abuses. And then they design a government structure. So they're starting with actions and theory and purpose. And see, these constitutions, and the only two states that didn't draft a new constitution in 1776 were Rhode Island and Connecticut. And the reason they didn't was they were, those charters, as some of you may know, were written when there wasn't a king in England. It's when Cromwell ruled and the Puritans ruled and the Long Parliament ruled. And so they were actually democratic constitutions because, of course, that's what Cromwell and the Long Parliament was all about. And so only in Connecticut and Rhode Island did the people elect the governor in colonial times. Every place else, you had an elected legislature like the House of Commons, limited electorate, but an elected lower house. Upper house appointed, just like the House of Lords. Nobody, the House of Lords are either they inherit their role or the king appoints them, royally appointed. And then a royal governor who was either appointed by the king or by a proprietor, like the Penn family, who was under the king back in England. And so they had a fundamentally non-Republican governments. And Paine described them as, in reality, as absolutist as anything in France. He might have been exaggerating a little bit, but that was the sense people had. And they had felt this tyranny of this authoritarian rule. And so they were fighting to make the people sovereign. And all the constitutions, you can look through them, they're basically there's Adams's approach and Franklin's approach. You see some following Franklin's Pennsylvania Constitution, some following Adams' thoughts on government. But all of them, all branches of government, directly or indirectly, are dependent on the people. They all have weak governors, because they'd experienced the king. They all give most power to the elected legislature, and the legislatures serve very short terms. 1 year is typical, sometimes even less. 1 year terms, so they have to go back to the people all the time. They insist on representative districts. The goal, they all said, was to create a state legislature that was truly representative of the people. So they wouldn't have liked gerrymandering, for example. They wanted representative districts, and they all said fair, free, and frequent elections. Choosing lawmakers. Many had term limits. You could only serve 2 years or 3 years out of every 6 years, so there'd be rotation. Because what they wanted truly was a form where the people would rule, because as Adams put it in Thoughts on Government, we want the government most likely to secure the happiness of the people, and the government that is likely to do that is the one that's most representative of the people.
So I'm really glad you brought up Norfolk, because the book starts wonderfully there, and there are other instances of the cataclysms that come on sort of the colonists, on the Americans from the British. And I guess what I was wondering was to what extent the creation of myth occurred around these events, right? So, in Norfolk, for instance, you mentioned that a lot of the a lot of the damage, and I'm not sure, and you can maybe let me know what you think about this, a lot of the damage may not have been caused by the British, may have been caused by the Patriots themselves, right? To what extent was there myth-making being done, not just, again, in July of 1776, but throughout that process?
It's a good point. There was once they were committed to independence, the Patriot propagandist, there were newspapers. American was a literate people, the most literate people ever in the history of the world. People could read. There were newspapers everywhere. People read newspapers. People got the news. There was also a tradition of reading newspapers in the pub, so people would gather around and people who could read would read them to others. And there was a very effective Patriot press that, that took this idea that the king is a tyrant. And Norfolk played into that perfectly the way it was presented. And that was the year before, after the Battle of Lexington, and if you know, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, yeah, there were some patriots shot. And, you know, and it was truly an outrage that under official British government policy, they marched into Lexington and just opened fire on a bunch of Americans who weren't going to fire at them, were standing up there with guns, but they weren't going to fire. And then in Concord. But on the way back, these militias just poured in from throughout Rhode Island and Massachusetts. They came from Connecticut later. And behind every bush, behind every house, behind every stone fence, picking off these redcoats going back to Boston by the hundreds. So the battle was drawn, but still they were blaming Parliament. And in response to that, the British Navy sails into Falmouth, which is Portsmouth, Maine now, but Falmouth, Massachusetts back then. And they just flatten it. Now, they could still say that was not government policy. That was a disgruntled group of Navy people who had heard about, they were coming down to Boston, and they'd heard what had happened to the troops in Boston, the British troops in Boston. But Norfolk was different. Norfolk was clearly the intentional act. And what happened is Norfolk was a loyalist. It was the key port, the entrance to the Chesapeake. And it was the key, Virginia's largest city by far. And, but it was a loyalist stronghold. And so the British had based their military there. And they could control everything going in and out of the Chesapeake, which meant to all the plantations up the Potomac, and Virginia was tidewater, and every other plantations were serviced by ships. And they could control all that. So, and they could easily defend it because the Great Dismal Swamp's right below it, and there was just one bridge across. But they mishandled their, so North Carolina, which is right across the way, Albemarle, North Carolina district. The North Carolina militia and the Virginia militia were trying to get rid of the British, and this was in November, December of 1775, dislodged the British, and they managed to take the city, and the British go out to these ships. Lord Dunsmore, the governor of Virginia, is on the ships, but also all the loyalists had left Norfolk, so there were hundreds, maybe thousands of loyalist citizens, men, women, children, they're enslaved people, on these hundreds of British ships. And so the Patriots are all, by the end of December, had taken the city. And so they're sitting there, and there are the ships, all with the cannons and everything, the British ships there, over 100. And they would be taking pot shots at each other. They'd be sitting behind the buildings, and they'd see a British soldier, and they'd shoot at him, and the British would be on the naval officer, seaman or an officer would shoot at America. They were shooting back and forth. And finally on January 1, the British decide to, because they're being fired at, to just cannonade the city and get rid of all the wharfs. Remember, it's the main port for Virginia and North Carolina. Cannonade the city, and therefore open up all the territory so that people couldn't be shooting at the ships, any protected territory. And that's then played up by the press, And of course, people live in those buildings. They're mostly warehouse buildings, but the British always claimed that the wind was blowing. They had waited that day because the wind was blowing to sea, so they could destroy the buildings near that were threatening to them, the protective places for the Americans, without burning down the city, which was a loyalist city, evacuated, but a loyalist city. And the Americans had already said, if we take, Washington had even written, if we take Norfolk, we got to destroy this city because we can't have a base for the British. Well, suddenly the fire burns down the whole city. And it was later determined, the Virginia government determined that it was the Patriots that burned down the rest of the city. But nobody knew that. It was presented as if the British had destroyed the whole city, just as they destroyed Falmouth. But what the difference was this was official government policy, the bombing of Norfolk. So this is a great example of what you ask, how battles, actions, and deeds interact. So the America, you look at newspapers, as I did, from New Hampshire to well, not really Georgia, but to South Carolina, Charleston. And the same newspapers would report the King's Speech of October saying the colonies would be in revolt, and we're going to send over more troops, 30,000 troops, we're going to send over mercenaries, we're going to send over the, thousands of ships. We're going to destroy this revolution. That's the King's Speech from the throne. They read that. The exact same time they get Common Sense, which is a whole theoretical argument of why any authoritarian government by very nature is corrupt and will lead to war. It's an argument, and what we need is representative government, Republican government, and if we're fighting for Republican government, no army in the world can defeat us. That's the argument, the 80-page Common Sense. And at the same time, they read about the destruction of Norfolk. Those are appearing in the same newspapers. People are learning about all of them in January. And that's what Washington writes about. He was from Virginia. News of Norfolk, coupled with what the king has declared us in revolt, coupled with the irrefutable logic of common sense, and everyone will support independence. So Norfolk was key in the way it was presented, but only because it was coupled beautifully with what the king had said and all the troops coming. So it was an atrocity coupled with an action of tyranny, coupled with an explanation by Paine that put all the pieces together.
So I know we're getting close to Q&A. I do have one more question, hopefully a quick one, just as a wrap up, and then we can move into Q&A, which is the book does such a wonderful job of explaining why 1776 matters. And I guess what I invite you to do is for the audience to say, what is necessary? What do you think is necessary? What is the benefit of thinking about 1776 in our current time? And then what do you think is the danger maybe of not thinking about it?
Well, the benefit, I think, of thinking about it, let me say this through the words of John Adams. John Adams, late in life, reconciled with Thomas Jefferson, as probably most of you know. And so he wrote Thomas Jefferson was long retired. They both lived forever. They both lived to the 50th anniversary of 1776. And late in that period, Adams writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And he said, as Adams was wont to do, he had plenty of free time. What was the revolution? ? And then he answers his own question. He says, it was not the war. The war was simply an consequence and effect of the revolution. The revolution was already over in 1776. The revolution was in the thoughts and minds of the American people. And so what were those thoughts? Certainly the war reverberated around, and it required a war. The war was a consequence and effect. And it was a reinforcing effect. But it was for what Thomas Paine, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin said was the most significant, thing in the history of the world. As he closes Common Sense, he says, we have a chance to begin the world anew. And John Adams in Thoughts on Government, something like this has not happened since the days of Noah coming off of the ark. That's how they thought of this. Now, countries become independent since the beginning of time. Countries splinter off of other countries. Roman people, new countries are formed off old countries. They didn't view it that way. And so what their novel experience was Republican government, popular rule, rule of law, written constitutions, as all of them said in different letters, that this is a government of not of men, but of laws. And that is what makes America distinct. And I think that matters today. That is the spirit of 1776 that people have always looked back to. Even somebody who didn't like the American Constitution, Frederick Douglass, says, what is the Independence Day for an enslaved person? And he said, even there, he said that he takes comforts in the ideas of 1776. And those ideas are the inalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that we are a rule of law, that we have representative government. And that is the core of the American dream, and that still matters today.
Wonderful, thank you very much. We do have time for some questions. I assume that over there, the spotlight on the microphone. So if anyone is interested or brave enough, or I'd invite you all to, line up behind the microphone and ask a question or two. Well, a question per person, of course.
It's not really scary.
No.
I swear. Okay, I see some brave souls coming to the microphone.
So happy we're getting my grandmother was a very loyal member of the DAR, so I was very pleased to be introduced by a DAR member. My ancestor was part of that Massachusetts militia besieging Boston that Washington came and took over from Framingham, Massachusetts. He was a sergeant. So we're close, not quite Connecticut, but nearby.
Yes, thank you for being here. It's a very interesting talk. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I've heard that originally it was life, liberty, and something to do with property, the right to own property or the ownership of property. Is there any was there any debate or truth about that?
Life, liberty, and property were the phrase that John Locke used in Second Treatise on Government. And certainly that book was very influential. But what's surprising, a lot of people sort of hypothesize that why did Jefferson turn from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? It really wasn't Jefferson's ideas. When you do a study of the year, you find the phrase that they're using. And it didn't matter who. It's letters from Washington, writings of Mason, the Thoughts on Government, Common Sense. They're all talking about the end of government. What is the purpose of government? The purpose, what should it be? Not to aggrandize a king. They're saying, no, it's to serve the people. And what does it mean to serve? They would talk about security. That's life. The government is to provide security. The government is to protect individual liberty. And they would all say it's to increase the net, as Adam said, the net total or the average total or the grand total of human happiness. they were all using the phrase happiness. And of course, for some people, owning property is happiness. And certainly they'd been fighting for no taxation without representative, don't take my property without representation. Sure, that was a concept, but beginning in common sense and in these individual letters and in the writings of individual soldiers back from the war that you read, the phrase they're using, yes, is liberty, absolutely. But it's happiness, and they didn't mean, going off to, a casino in Atlantic City. Maybe for some that's what they meant, but you never get the sense, because they're always talking about virtue. They're talking about that. But when you think about it, happiness. Sure, some people find happiness in money, some people find happiness in property, some people find happiness in a wonderful married life, some people find happiness in a whole variety of different things. So it was a more general term, and that was the common language of the day that you're hearing from in the newspapers and everyone. So it's not against property. Certainly these people cared profoundly for property rights, and they didn't want government taking their property without representation. It'd only be your duly representative electors. And if you read the list of grievances in every state constitution, in every document in the Declaration of Independence, certainly it's taking property without, or destroying property, destroying Falmouth, destroying Norfolk. Certainly that was very important, but the happiness was the broad concept that people were using. And, I think it means more to more people. And to say that the end of government is increasing human happiness, that's a beautiful concept to me.
Pretty good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been so interesting and really fun. So my question is, if in your research, if you uncovered any unsung hero of 1776 that we might not be on our radar?
Well, when I follow these individual soldiers, there are a variety of them that just, their words just stand out. If you want a bigger level one, out of nowhere, now this is not an individual soldier, and he later got plenty of credit, but Knox, a 22-year-old bookstore owner in Boston, who had always, like probably some of your kids, he always liked cannons, and he always liked artillery, and he always read, he came from nothing in particular, and he worked in a bookstore, and he read all the books about artillery, and so he signs up, and he's 21 years old, and then he starts, he becomes the artillery officer for self-taught. He'd never fired a cannon before, self-taught artillery. And he's the one who figures out how to get those cannons down from Ticonderoga. They knew that the only way they could get the British out of Boston, Boston was then like an island. It was a little neck of land. It was an island. There was no back bay. It was just, and then there was a small neck of land back. And so there was, at the north side, there was Bunker Hill, and on the south, across the water, and on the south, across the Charles River, and on the other side, there was Dorchester Heights, a little further away. And the British always knew that they were totally safe in Boston as long as they had their naval ships, because they controlled the harbor, and the Americans had no ships, really. But they knew they were vulnerable because of Bunker Hill, and that's why they attacked Bunker Hill. The Americans, they found out, a day ahead of time, because there were so many spies, and this is before Washington's down there, and they quickly try to occupy Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, and but they don't have a lot of ammunition. But they're up there, they dig in a little bit, and then the British troops march up. Half the British army marched up, and they said, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, because we don't have any bullets. And they slaughter them. They absolutely just slaughtered the British. Their officers, especially because the officers are leading. But finally, they run out of bullets and they have to run. And the British get the hill. And that left the only way to get rid of the Boston, the only way. And Washington had all these crazy ideas, like wait till the harbor freezes over and have the men go over in skates and everything. And his officers say that would never work. Was Breed's Hill, was Dorchester Heights, which is, if you go up there, it's about where the Kennedy Library is now. And it was high, even higher than Bunker Hill. But they didn't have any cannons that could reach that far. And that's where Ticonderoga, because the Connecticut militia had taken Ticonderoga, and there were all these big cannons there because Ticonderoga was designed to defend the colonies from the French coming down from Montreal and Quebec. But it hadn't been used since the French and Indian War, and there were all these just cannons sitting there, including mortars, but also big cannons. And the British knew that, and the Americans knew that. And everybody knew if you could get the cannons down to Dorchester Heights, you could blow the British out of Boston. They'd have to leave, because you could just destroy their ships and And it was Knox, this young bookstore salesman. He comes up with this idea, and he goes up to Washington. Just this, he's not even an officer then. He goes up to Washington, and he explains, I think I can get the cannons down there if we wait till in the winter. We'll slide them over the hills. We'll slide them over the Berkshires. We'll just pull them down the Lake George, and then across to Albany, down the Hudson a little bit, and then go across basically where Pittsfield is. Pull them over the snow. And so Washington gives them $100, and he takes his brother, and he goes over, and he says, and you can use that. You can command any militia you can find over there. You can rent any cows, and he does it. He gets them across, and then Washington secretly puts them on, uses all these devices to hide, he builds screens so he can get them up. And how Clinton, who was the best general the British had, kept telling us, we're in trouble. We've got to occupy, just like we occupy Bunker Hill, we've got to occupy Dorchester Heights. And Howe says, no problem, we'll be fine. They don't know how to do that. They can't take it, and we can take it in a moment's notice if we need to. And he wakes up one morning, and all these cannons are up there. And he can do nothing else but evacuate Boston. And that the moral effect of throwing the British Army out of Boston, which happens then in the spring of that year, reinforces Paine's line that with this cause, we can defeat any army in the world, because the Patriot propaganda portrayed that the Americans, in the first victory of the war, because Bunker Hill was a loss in the end, and so was Lexington and Concord, in the first victory of the war, didn't take a fight, but that Washington's army had forced the British army to evacuate Boston. And that was, the news of that's what made Washington a hero. He was lionized, statues were made of them. Peale made that amazing painting of him standing with Boston Harbor in the background. He was feted. He became, America's conquering hero because of what one little bookstore guy had done.
Well, thank you all. Thank you to the Westport Library. Thank you, Ed. It's been fantastic talking with you this evening.
Thank you for coming out on this Veterans Day. My parents were both veterans. It's a very special day for me. So thank you, and thank you to the DAR and to the library.
Yes.
I'd also like to thank you, Aaron, for coming out. And on behalf of all of our partners, the Westport Museum for History and Culture and the local VFW, and of course the DAR, thank you all for coming in and diving a little deeper into 1776. Copies of the book are available for purchase. So thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful night.